You're listening to Crushing Club Marketing, a podcast for progressive club leaders ready to increase their club's revenue. Time for change begins right now. It's about the people. And as a leader, you know this is true when it comes to delivering outstanding member experiences. Without top talent, it's difficult to elevate your club to the highest standards. Yet, identifying the best talent is difficult. After all, without good intel, how do you know who you're hiring? Jodie Cunningham is an expert in behavioral assessments and a certified Predictive Index partner. She joins me in this episode to share how assessments can help you put together a dream team at your club. I am a firm believer that a club will never meet its standards of excellence if it doesn't hire the right people. And that's not just for clubs, that's probably any business. Because as you know, when a club falls short in member satisfaction, those clubs are always looking for new members. Plus, they have the burden of a sketchy reputation in the community. And some people are wired for member service. Some people are not. And you see that every day. And it doesn't matter if it's a lifeguard, a server, or your superintendent. Anyone that has an impact on member experience has to be fully aligned with the mission and vision of the club for that club to reach the highest standards. Yet, it's really hard to do, especially at a time when it's difficult, extremely difficult, to attract and retain the best people. Plus, you're trying to find people in a very small window of time, usually, and you may not have the luxury of spending hours and hours interviewing candidates. So you're kind of stuck, needing to find the best people and having a very limited amount of time to do so. So that is where assessments can come into play. Now, if you've been working a long time, there's a good chance you've taken some kind of behavioral assessment. StrengthsFinders, Myers-Briggs, the Enneagram, or maybe even Predictive Index. There are a bunch of them out there, and they're used by businesses around the world, as you know. So you may have even used one at your club when you're hiring people. But I can tell you, as a small business owner, I love assessments. I'm a total junkie, and here's why. They help you identify the right people. They also help you coach them once you've hired them. So we all have our own strengths and weaknesses, right? And using assessments is another layer of intel just to make sure you've got someone who's wired to do the job you need them to do. Behavioral assessments can help you determine if you're hiring the right person for a specific job. They can also help you coach that person so that they can become the best they can be, which also, by the way, helps you to become a better employer and you develop that reputation as well. You may be familiar with my guest in this episode, Jodie Cunningham. As I mentioned in the intro, she is the owner of Optimus Talent Partners, and she's also an HR consultant for Kaplan, Keebler & Wallace. Her assessment sweet spot is the Predictive Index, a leading HR platform that helps employers hire and coach their teams to success. Jodie, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Spring is around the corner here in the upper Midwest, and man, it always feels better when it gets a little warmer.
It absolutely does. Same here. I'm in the Western Carolina mountains, and the sun is out today, which is amazing. I love it.
Beautiful part of the country, though. I love it. Love it there.
Yes.
For people who aren't familiar with you and your work, let's tell folks a little bit about you and your background and how you got to where you are.
Absolutely. Well, my name is Jodie Cunningham. I am the owner of Optimus Talent Partners. I'm a certified partner with Predictive Index, and I'm also a HR search consultant for Kaplan, Keebler & Wallace. So the business card is quite packed.
Yeah.
But I do a lot of really talent-focused consulting and support, specifically in private clubs. I do have clients certainly outside of private clubs, but I spend a majority of my time with private clubs. And really my background is human resources. So I started way back in the day as a front desk agent at a hotel in Breckenridge, Colorado. Eventually made my way into human resources and realized that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. So went back to school and got my master's degree in human resources management, and then started my HR career in hotels. Several hotels, but most, probably the longest career timeline was with the Four Seasons. So luxury hospitality, that's really where I worked my way up. And then I decided to step away from hospitality and I started a career in professional sports, still in human resources. I was not
Right.
on the field. I was not the talent, but I worked in the NFL for about 5 seasons with the St. Louis Rams. And of course, if you know football, they're not the St. Louis Rams, they're the LA Rams.
Right.
And so now, so once they moved to LA, I decided to step into my own business. And that's when I opened Optimus Talent Partners and became a certified partner with Predictive Index. And it was actually really in both starting at the Four Seasons as well as in the NFL that I started really getting ingrained in this idea of behavioral science and why people do what they do and why assessment data is so important, which of course is why what we're talking about today.
Yeah, so interesting. So most of your career prior to going on your own was in hospitality, and yet, with the Rams, it was also director of employee experience, which is kind of aligned in a way, I would imagine, right? I mean,
Absolutely. Well, and really the interesting thing about that role is they prior to my arrival, they'd never had anyone in the human resources spot. And the purpose of them creating that role was one, they've realized that HR was really important in their organization, but more specifically, and to the point that we're probably going to talk more about, is that they were looking for an employee culture change. They felt like they had some ways to go to get better from an employee culture, and they felt that having myself in that role to really help drive the culture and guide that process was really important. So, so yeah, it was all people focused.
so interesting. And then with your background, with so many years with the Four Seasons, I mean, hospitality at that end, I mean, they are really focused on the type of person that they're hiring for that role, I'm assuming. And I'm just
Absolutely.
curious your thoughts as far as like how much the culture has to do, the culture of the organization, and whether that's core values or whatever that is, mission statement, right? The core values have like how does that connect all the way down to what the customer, or in this case, the member experience is? Like can you help make that connection?
Oh, absolutely. Culture, first of all, many times we talk about the culture of our organization. Well, an organization doesn't have culture. It's the people in the organization that create that feeling of culture. And you take one person out and put a new person in, it's going to change the culture.
Mhm.
And so being very, very focused on what type of culture you want to create in any organization is critical. And that's really what I felt, certainly during my 10 years with the Four Seasons, I felt they did exceptionally well. And a big component of that is how they selected talent, no matter what the role. Dishwasher, food and beverage manager, assistant general manager, whatever the role was, they were very particular in terms of who they were adding into their culture, because they understood that you add one wrong person in there and it can really have some significant changes. And in our case, on the guest experience. And
Mhm.
so the goal was to ensure that we were building a strong culture. To that end, for an example, in the hiring process, if you were applying for a job at the Four Seasons, you went through a minimum of 4 interviews, sometimes 5,
Mm.
and your last interview was with the general manager. So if you were a dishwasher, if you were a food server, if you were a busser, it didn't matter what your job was. There wasn't anybody that wasn't hired that didn't get a chance to meet the GM, and that the GM didn't get a chance to meet that candidate, because of how important every single person is on the team to ensure that the culture is strong.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. It's one of those things that when you hear people talk about that, it's like, well, yeah, okay, well, that sounds easy, but it is one of those things that speaks easy and it's hard to do. What do most private clubs overlook when it comes to building the right team? And so that they can deliver that member experience that club leaders expect to deliver.
Absolutely. I think there's a couple different things that sometimes trip us up. One is, to some extent, depending on the size of your club, you typically don't have a talent quarterback. So you don't have an HR person at your club because you might be small, right? And if any of the listeners have ever been to any of my CMAA World Conference classes, usually I'm talking about adding an HR person because of how important that talent quarterback is. And when you have somebody that is basically overseeing how we're going about selecting talent, you have a much better chance of being very purposeful in making the right decisions. I think another thing that maybe trips us up is we're so focused on getting bodies in positions that we don't take a step back and talk about what are we looking at big picture? What can we do better? What do we already do really well? And from a talent perspective, what do we need more of and what do we need less of? Before we start looking at applicants and looking at their backgrounds and looking at where they're coming from, we need to know as a club, what do we need? It's not about the applicant, it's about us. It's about our member experience. And so being very purposeful in knowing what kind of talent do I need? Then at that point, it's creating the recruitment strategy. And what I often find is that we tend, when I talk about recruitment and I ask clubs, what do you do to recruit? They say, well, we post on Indeed or LinkedIn and that sort of thing. And then it's silent, right? And what I try to get across is recruitment is an action verb. It's not something that you just passively do, post a job and then wait, but it is building a pipeline. And I think that's really an area of opportunity as well, because clubs are like the best kept secret. You know, we're behind these big gates and there's big signs that say members only. So people don't even know you can work at a private club. They don't even know how awesome it is. And so we inside the gates need to get outside the gates and be the ambassador of, hey, I know you've been exploring hospitality, maybe in hotels, but let's focus on clubs. And let me tell you a little bit about why it's so awesome to work at a private club and start to introduce that. And that's really part of the branding and creating a pipeline of talent, you know, connecting with schools and universities and different programs that are trying to place people in different industries. And so being much more purposeful on how we do that. And when I say recruitment strategy, I also mean it's a strategy. It's not like, let's just throw all kinds of stuff up on the wall and see what sticks. It's being purposeful to say, we're going to spend our time, because we don't have a ton of it, we've got a whole operation to run, purposely going down these 3 avenues to find talent. And I would also add that it's everybody's job to recruit. So if you do happen to be lucky enough to have a great HR professional at your club, it's not that person's job to recruit. Yes, that's part of his or her job, but it's every manager. And frankly, it's every employee. We're all ambassadors of the club. And so really arming everybody on the team to be recruiters when they're out and about, going to restaurants, going to laundromats, going to church, recruit. So I think recruitment is an area that we probably don't focus enough on. And of course, building that type pipeline is going to eventually affect your culture.
Right. Yeah. Really interesting. I mean, instead of falling into reactive mode, like that person just quit, now I got to go find that person. What if you have people in your back pocket that you've known or talked to or heard about or things like that, so that level of communication, all of it takes time, I do want to just, without at risk of getting too esoteric in the conversation though, I do want to just get your thoughts on really clubs making sure they really understand who they are. For example, is it, because if you see yourself as being elite and maybe elite equals stuffy and very formal versus, a private club where the staff is very outgoing, very friendly. We call people members by their first name and things like that. I mean, that culture really sort of dictates the type of person that's going to fit as well. I mean, it seems obvious, but it seems so often people are like, well, we're a private club. I mean, come on. Don't they know?
No, but it absolutely is important having an understanding of what type of environment we're going to be putting people into.
Right.
And I know we're going to talk more about behavioral science here in a second, but I'm going to throw in a few words here. If you have a much more kind of tight, buttoned up club environment where everybody is Mrs. and Mr. and thank you and it's my pleasure, and a much more formal environment, you need individuals that are wired for that level of formality.
Right.
If you have a bit more of a casual environment, you need individuals that are wired for that type of environment. If you have an environment in the club where you value tradition and you're not looking to make any big, swift changes in the future, well, you need to have individuals that are comfortable with process and familiar and doing things over and over again and not needing to change things.
Right.
Whereas if you're trying to make change and change the trajectory of your club, you need change agents. So having an understanding of what does the club need, what type of experience are we trying to provide, having that defined is critically important before you can say, what kind of people do I need?
Right. And it's so funny that is something that can get, I don't know, so many of these things, I think with a lot of leadership, not just in the private club industry, but in business, can get like, yeah, I don't need the warm and fuzzies, like, but it really does matter. So, just, as we dive into some more tactical, just, thinking around assessments, before you start working with a new client or a club or a contact, what are they experiencing? Like, what do they usually come to you with and say, "Oh my gosh, Jodie, this is happening," or and is it fairly similar?
hmm Well, I think it could be a variety of different things because typically, from a consulting perspective, I will problem solve a lot of different types of problems. I mean, there could be relationship problems between leadership and on the leadership team. It could be a situation where they have a retention problem, and we need to diagnose why that retention problem is happening. There may be a situation where they just don't have a pipeline of talent, so that as people are leaving, they don't have succession planning in place. So there's a lot of different things that we can troubleshoot, especially using behavioral data. So when we think about what types of problems clubs are trying to solve, many times when I get involved, it also has to do with they're looking to replace somebody, right? So when
Mhm.
I come in as a search consultant and they're looking to replace their HR professional or any of my colleagues in a variety of different positions throughout the club, that's typically how we first get involved. And then at that point, we start what I refer to as kind of the discovery,
Mhm.
discovering who is the club, not just who they are on paper, but who they actually are in person. A lot of interviewing, a lot of surveying, and those sorts of things to better understand where are we now and where do you want to be so that I
Mhm.
can figure out what kind of talent you need to get there. Or if there's a problem, why is the problem happening? And usually you got to peel back 1,000 layers to figure
Mhm.
out what the real problem is, and
Mhm.
then start to put together a plan to solve that problem. Many times when there's a problem, it has a lot to do with how people work with each other
Mm.
and
Interesting.
all the different diverse approaches and work styles and things like that. And so many times that's where I start. And that's really where kind of the assessment data comes into play.
Very interesting. Are there certain issues that you see kind of over and over, or recruiting issues, in your travels?
Yeah, I would say, well, we've already talked about the fact that maybe we don't do a good job recruiting officially,
Right.
and you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes,
Yeah.
recruiting. But I think many times, as we mentioned, hiring out of desperation rather than out of a strategic approach, hiring based solely on work history.
Mhm. Mm.
Typically, we hire based on somebody's resume, but we fire for behavioral reasons.
Mhm.
So we've got to pay attention to those behaviors when we hire so that we know and we get ahead of any problems that may happen. But many times we just naturally hire based on where somebody's worked. They've worked at another high-end private club. They've got golf club experience. They've, got some sort of background that aligns with who we are as a club. Just because they worked someplace else that's similar to where you are doesn't mean they were any good at it. It just
Mhm.
meant somebody hired them
Right.
and it's on their resume. So we've got to better understand from a behavioral perspective, what type of behaviors does somebody need in any given position within our organization to make sure that they're successful. And so really kind of that assessment process also to some extent goes along with making sure that managers know what behaviors are necessary and critical for high performance in the role.
Mhm. Got it. So let's bring in the assessment piece of this. So, because if someone's looking to fill a position, and if historically they just, post an Indeed and they're just, talking to warm bodies, um, how do assessments help?
Well, I think there's a couple different things. One, assessments are going to help you understand how this person's going to interact with your team, with your members, how they're going to approach the work that they do. So what it is it's kind of like when you go to you got a pain, you go to the doctor and they take an x-ray, right? They could just look at you from the outside and do a couple things and see if they could diagnose what's wrong. But once they have the x-ray, now they know what's going on and they can tell you from the inside out what it is that the problem is and how we're going to solve it. Same with an assessment. Basically, the assessment is helping us from the inside out, understanding who it is that's sitting in front of us and who eventually will show up. A lot of times in the interview process, people behave the way they think they're supposed to behave to get the job.
Hmm.
That's what they want, right? They want
Right.
the job. And you
Yeah.
want to give them the job because you want to close the job.
Yeah.
But the problem is who they are during the interview could be very different than who they are on day 91 when they pass their probationary period,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so having an understanding of who's actually going to show up when they get comfortable, when they really start to get in the flow of their work, and that's where assessments come into play. You can also use assessment data to predict what type of unique abilities they're going to offer the team.
Mhm.
So one thing that trips us up sometimes is we tend to hire just like us, right? So if I hire somebody that I think is just like me, why wouldn't I want to hire them? I mean, I think I'm awesome.
Right.
Why would I want a whole team of me, right?
Right. Yeah.
But the problem is if you hire people just like yourself, you get all the same strengths and all the same weaknesses or cautions. And so behavioral assessments help us pinpoint, you know what, this person is different than me. And that's important because I need that perspective on this team. So that data can also help us kind of nip in the bud any kind of unconscious bias, you know, and hiring people just like us. And, you know, again, it's going to help us understand exactly how they're going to align with the job. So are they proactive? Are they a process builder? Are they a change agent? Are they a collaborator? Are they highly detailed specialists in their area? And is that what we need for the job? And what's going to make them successful?
Yeah, my gosh, there are a million ways to go at this exact point in the conversation. And I'm just wondering, like, maybe if we keep it a little bit higher level, I guess I'd just love to talk a little bit about what assessments are and what they are not. You know, it's like if you're a leader and you're thinking like, oh yeah, we'll start using assessments and we'll just automatically know who the right people are because it's going to say so on this behavioral assessment. You may be misled in thinking that way. But so when you think about that, what is the best way to actually use these behavioral assessments?
Well, I think that's a great question. One thing that I always like to point out with behavioral assessments is it's one piece of the puzzle, right? So it's an incredibly important piece because as long as you're using a scientifically validated and reliable assessment, it's an incredibly important piece, but it's one piece of the puzzle. Humans are complex. Right. So, you know, many times when I talk to leaders about their own PI assessment and or behavioral assessment that they're using, I say, you know, it's your assessment's not good or bad, right or wrong. You are who you are. You have strengths and you have cautions. The thing that's critical is that you're aware of those strengths and you're aware of those cautions. And when something is going to trip you up, you have the self-awareness to know, you know what, I need to engage in some sort of tool that's going to help me not get tripped up when that happens. I also think it's important that we remember that people can adapt. Humans can adapt. We do it every day, right? The thing to remember, though, is that we can only adapt for short periods of time. So if you're asking me to be somebody I'm not naturally, can I do it? Of course. I can stretch, right? But I can only stretch like a rubber band for short periods of time. Over long periods of time or under situations of stress, I'm going to revert back to who I am naturally. And so hopefully that's who you actually wanted when you hired me. But, you know, that way you have an understanding of how much can you push somebody and how consistently can they change over time. So I think, you know, the assessment data is a starting point, and then interviewing questions, good quality interviewing questions to dig into that data and understand how somebody has learned to overcome some of those weaknesses is really important. And then I also think when we think about assessments and what's important about relying on them, your assessment should never be an excuse for poor performance or bad behavior. So you can't just say, well, you know what, my assessment says I tend to be more introverted and probably more direct in my communication style. So if I'm abrasive, just deal with it. That's how I'm wired.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
You knew that. Right.
Yeah. But the challenge is if your job requires you to be warm and fuzzy, then you have to figure out how to adapt to meet the expectations of your job. So I think, you know, those are things when I think about rules of assessments that we need to pay attention to. How club leaders can use assessments, I think throughout the entire employee life cycle. Typically, we talk about utilizing assessments in the hiring process, which is what typically people have experience in, right? So they have a behavioral assessment and they use it in the hiring decision. But then that same assessment helps us understand how do we set up their onboarding program, right? How much social interaction do they need? How much detail do they need? This assessment is going to tell me exactly what I need to feed into this person in their onboarding to set them up for success. It also is going to help the manager better understand when I'm giving Jodie feedback, based on how she's wired, this is how I should frame up the feedback. These are things that I should say that are really going to resonate and she's going to pay attention to. So certainly job feedback or managing conflict. I will say, when I was at the Four Seasons, when I had assessment data, typically when you're an HR role, and certainly every kind of manager deals with this, Ed walks into my office and says, "I can't work with Jodie anymore. She's driving me nuts." Okay, well, let's pull out the assessments and take a look at why they're wired differently,
Right.
and help them understand those differences. So managing conflict, team dynamics, team building. When
Right.
you're adding somebody new to your leadership team, what do you need more of and what do you need less of
Right.
to help you achieve your strategic plan?
Yeah.
It's all based on that data. So performance management, coaching, succession planning. I mean, there's 1,000 different ways that you can use this data, but typically people start using it in the hiring process.
Yeah. And yet, like, again, when you're building a team, a cohesive team that's connected and that cares about each other, right? That they are really united in that way, understanding what you need based upon the people that you have. And now we're getting into like bringing assessments together as well, which I know we can talk
Mhm.
more about here. But from a very tactical perspective, how would you recommend using assessments from like when to introduce them? Interviewing is so much a part of it, and a lot of a part of this whole process. And I know for our company, at least, what I've always liked to do is bring in the assessment. It's probably towards the end, but we'll interview first, then do an assessment and ask more questions, have another follow-up interview after that to say, you're seeing this, tell me about a time when this came up, or how did that, is there
Mhm.
is there a recommended way of like the timing of, where that happens in the interview process?
Absolutely. So, and it'll also have to do with how much access you have to assessments. So,
Mhm.
perfect world, you should be assessing at the moment that they're applying for the job, because
Oh,
now you have their work history and you have their behavioral profile.
okay.
So based on where they've worked, you now have their job knowledge, their education, certifications, experience. That's their work history. But then you also have their behavioral makeup. And when you know what you need, and you've got what we refer to as a job target, we have an objective job target that we're looking for behaviorally, you can see how good of a match somebody is right when you see that behavioral assessment.
Mhm.
Now, the assessments I use are very quick, so it's not going to be off-putting for a candidate to take another 5 minutes to take a quick assessment, or what I
Sure.
like to refer to as a survey.
A survey.
But
Okay.
if your assessment's 45 minutes long, maybe it doesn't make sense that you do it right off the bat, because you
Right.
could end up with some attrition of candidates. They're like, "I'm not wasting that much time on this job. I don't even know if I'm going to get an interview."
Yeah. Right.
So how you use it really is determined by what type of assessment you have. But then once you have that data, now that helps funnel the candidates to determine, who should I meet with first? This person looks great on paper, but they're a really bad match behaviorally. Well, maybe we don't spend our time yet, because our time is really valuable on that candidate. We
Right.
look at the candidate that is really well wired for this job, but may not quite have all the work experience. Think of
Yeah.
food server or busser or dishwasher. You're going to teach them to do the job the way you want it done at your club,
Mhm.
but you're not going to be able to change their behavioral makeup.
Mhm.
So being able to funnel candidates with that behavioral data can be really helpful. The other thing that it does is it helps you as the hiring manager ask the right questions.
Mhm.
So you're certainly really great, I'm sure, at asking functional interview questions, right? How much can you lift? And tell me about your wine knowledge and blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
But are we really good at asking behavioral-based questions of, tell me about a time when you had to deal with a coworker that you didn't get along with?
Mhm.
And what many times hiring assessments will do is give you great interviewing questions to ask in the process. So you're not only assessing job knowledge, but you're assessing behavioral fit.
Mhm. And that is where culture lies, right? It's like
Mhm.
aligning how they handle it from a behavioral perspective with the culture of your club. Because, like what you're saying, I mean, that they can lift something or they can balance a tray with, 15 water glasses on it is one thing. But, yeah, it's such an interesting, just an interesting tool in that way. So, um, let's just talk a little bit more about. I was going to ask you. Sorry to interrupt myself. The survey, quote unquote, air quotes.
Right.
Um, So you're like, you recommend doing that right off the bat. I mean, that's fair to do. I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
part of it. It's like, is an applicant going to go like, well, I'm not doing this stupid survey. I don't even know if I want to work here. Like, I mean,
Right.
maybe that's an indicator too as to whether or not it's the right person.
Right. So I think there's a couple of ways to answer that question. I think one, survey length is really important. And so depending on what type of tool you use, that will determine likely where you put it in the interview process as to not cause attrition
Hmm.
to potential candidates. The other thing too is what does it cost, right? If you're paying per click, right, and it costs you
Hmm.
$200 every time you send an assessment, you're probably thinking really hard and fast about when I'm going to actually send it because I only want to use it on people I actually want.
Right.
Well, the challenge
Exactly.
is you then miss out on potential candidates that because maybe on paper they didn't look really solid, but then behaviorally they're 10 out of 10, right?
Sure.
And you're going to, again, teach them and train them to do it your club way. And depending on the level of job, that may be easier or harder, but you may miss out on somebody because you don't do it at the very beginning. So it's really working with your support staff that's helping you with your assessment to determine where should it go in the interviewing process. I think also you mentioned fairness. So absolutely, fairness comes into play when you use assessments in the hiring process. And the critical component when picking an assessment is you need to make sure that you have an objective job target that you're comparing a candidate to.
Mhm.
So you should never just do an assessment. You know, if I send you an assessment for a job and I get it back and I'm like, oh, this sounds good, and I hire you, I'm not comparing your data to the objective data that we've set for this job.
Mhm.
And that's where you can get into hot water with the EEOC. the,
Mhm.
you never want a letter from them, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so you need to have objective job targets to which you're comparing candidates to. Because if you're just sending out assessments and then using your own personal bias,
Yeah.
whether unconscious or conscious, that can get you into some hot water. So I can't stress that enough. Those objective job targets are really important.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so we're talking a lot about different behavioral assessments. There are a lot of different assessments out there. How does a club leader know what assessment to look at? And I mean, you talk about the interworkings of other assessments and being able to interpret data.
Yeah.
And clubs have so many different types of employees. The hourly, like
Mhm.
you said, the busboy. Do the busboys do them as well as your department heads? And how should the club leader uh, assess the assessments?
Absolutely. So I think there's a couple basic things we need to know. Like, what are we trying to accomplish in utilizing this assessment? Are we trying to streamline the hiring process? Are we trying to enhance the quality of the candidate that we're getting? Are we trying to make sure that we're utilizing this assessment all the way through the employee life cycle? Or is the idea that I'm going to assess this candidate, hire them, and then never look at this report again? So understand how you think you want to use it. Then from there, you have to understand how much money you're willing to spend on it.
Mhm.
Assessments will come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and resources. The thing I like to keep in mind when I'm talking to potential prospects about the assessments that I provide is how much does it cost you when you make a bad hire? So that's also a piece of data that, to the extent you can gather it, that will help you justify whether or not you're willing to pay a certain amount for access to assessments.
Mhm.
Typically, if you were to research with SHRM, Society of Human Resources Management, they say on average, when you make a bad hire, it will cost your company about 30% of their annual salary. So like if you have an employee who makes about $30,000 a year, if you got that hire wrong, it's costing you about $9,000-ish because you
Mhm.
got it wrong.
Mhm.
And so if your assessment access is only $7,000, basically what that's telling you is it's going to pay for itself in one bad hire.
Mhm.
So being able to understand what is the cost of getting it wrong, and those costs are a couple different things. Certainly direct costs, that's what everybody thinks about: salary, benefits, taxes, recruitment costs, training costs, productivity costs, those sorts of
Sure.
things. But then there's all that indirect cost, and that's the cost to morale, the
Right.
impact to your culture, the cost of maybe even some legal issues, right? If you make a bad hire and then you have to fire somebody and you don't do it right, and there could be all kinds of legal issues. And so there's both direct and indirect costs that go into deciding how much money do I actually have or should have to put towards a resource like this? And then when picking out the assessment, I think there's a few things that we should pay attention to. One, is it validated for the workplace? So we're looking at job-related criteria. So make sure your assessment is about hiring for job-related criteria. Secondly, is it scientifically validated and reliable? So where you get in trouble with the EEOC is when you're using an assessment that's not scientifically validated and reliable. You can Google behavioral assessments online and take one, and it'll tell you what kind of animal you are, right?
Right.
That's not a validated, scientifically reliable assessment. So let's not use those things because I want to be an owl. Yeah. So I think that science is probably absolutely top one, top two, making sure that that box is checked and that you talk to your legal counsel about that to say, here's how we're thinking about using it. Do you agree? Pricing model per click versus an annual subscription. If you want to use it top to bottom for every candidate, there are resources out there that allow you just pay one flat fee and you can use it on an unlimited basis. You get 100 dishwasher candidates, you assess 100 dishwashers. So there's no limit on how you use it. And then to the point we talked about earlier, I think assessment length is really important. How long of an assessment are your candidates willing to take before you lose them? So that's something you pay attention to. And, a few other things about how the data is gathered, free choice versus forced choice assessments, how the results are presented. If managers are trying to figure this stuff out, is it easy? Is it, not that they can't dig in and become assessment experts, but they don't have time for that.
Right.
So
That's
how do we
huge.
make it easy on them? Right.
Right. Yeah.
So we want to ensure usage. So you don't want to purchase an assessment tool and then nobody use it because it's too complicated, it's too cumbersome. And what type of support are you going to get if you utilize a product? Is there somebody there that's kind of your phone a friend at the 11th hour to say, hey, can you look at these two assessments and tell me what I'm missing here before I make a hiring decision?
Yeah.
Is there something on your bench that's going to help you?
It's interesting because, there are so many, we all know whether it's Myers-Briggs or Strengths Finders and some of these where it's sort of like, it's all packaged really well. And you can kind of see, oh, well, your, number one strength is, woo or whatever that is, right?
Right.
And while it might be, and I'm not knocking it. I mean, I've used Strengths Finders and done it several times and reminded of what my strengths are in that, which my wife doesn't like, but whatever, that's different. But but my point is that it may not give you all the insight. It's easy to read and easy to kind of understand, but even when you start to mix and match your strengths and my strengths and someone else's strengths, and kind of going back to what you were saying before, I mean, it's it can get complicated, and then who do you ask?
Exactly.
And that's it's a really interesting thing. There's so many aspects about behavioral assessments that I think are so interesting that the people will go to for reasons why they won't use them or why they don't want to use them. Cost, fun, they're kind of silly. They just say, oh, well, my number one strength is woo. Like, how does that help me? Right. And all those things.
Right.
And yet when you dive into it and start peeling that onion back, like you were talking about the cost of making the wrong hire. I mean, I just will add my own little texture, as an entrepreneur, and I've made so many wrong hires. It is, the morale thing. We hired one person right now, and I think everyone on our team knew she was the wrong hire except for me.
Right.
And I'm like convincing myself that no, she was a good hire. It's like, and in fact, one of my longtime employees the other day brought her up the other day, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm still living with this. This is probably 10 years ago, but and not to mention the cost of maybe like if this bad hire does something that costs you your job,
Right.
It's like so many things, but that time and morale, I mean, it's real. These are real
Absolutely.
issues,
Yeah. Well, and I think too, to your point of having an understanding of the support, right? One of the things that I do with my clients, first of all, they all go through education, right? So it's not just that we, activate their software and then they're on their own, but going through education and understanding how to read the assessment. But even more than that, kind of putting the color commentary to it. So, okay,
Mhm.
so this person is high formality. So what does that mean for you day to day? Well, it means that likely when you go to give this person feedback, they may bristle a little bit. They may be a little bit sensitive to criticism. And the reason why is because their goal in life is to be perfect. So what that means is you need to stroke the fact that they're doing the majority of their job really, really well. They're
Mhm.
experts in their area. There's just one area that we need to tweak. And that's why I'm here to make sure that I can help you be perfect.
Mhm.
So the way we deliver the feedback is based on how somebody's wired. And so that's my role with all of the leaders that utilize the assessments I support, is helping them go, they'll call me regularly to say, okay, I got a performance issue. Here's the assessment. Here's the issue. How do I deal with this?
Mhm.
And that's when I come in to say, oh, well, here's why it's happening. I'll tell you right now that I see the PI, the assessment, and this is how you approach fixing it.
Yeah.
And then we walk through it. And so that's where, when I say support, I think support is really important. Rather than it just being a one and done assessment that gathers dust up on the shelf, you need to partner with somebody that's going to help you understand why people do what they do.
Right.
Because likely as the manager, you don't have time to become the expert, but you need an expert on your bench.
Yeah, and I mean, just while I was listening to you, it brought in the whole idea of leadership and leadership style. Like I hear some people going, "What do you mean? Like I'm not going to treat that person any differently. Like what I have because they want to be perfect, I have to like pander to them or some way." It's like it's not that. It's not about
No,
that. It really is like if you want the most out of your people to really understand in many ways how to adapt to them, but that information and the data that you're getting all feeds that. Now, if you want to be that iron-fisted leader, it's like, just do it
Mhm.
my way, damn it, and don't ask questions. And I'm not, why am I going to
Yep.
do this? I'll tell you what I need, right? It's like, well, then that's probably going to have a direct impact on your member experience, I would imagine as well, potentially.
Absolutely. Well, and it's a two-way street. So you're talking about adapting your leadership style to meet the needs of the employee. Yes, that's half the equation.
Mhm.
But it's also teaching the employee about how you're wired. And so helping them understand how you will accept feedback, how you should be approached, how you should be communicated with. Every relationship, no matter if it's supervisor subordinate, if it's peer, frankly, it's your relationships at home. It's a
Mhm.
two-way street. I mean, frankly, I am half the problem of every communication problem in any relationship that I have
Right.
because I'm part of it, right?
Yeah.
And the assessment data helps you understand why it's happening and how you can adjust your approach and the approach of the other person to work effectively together. And, I quite often teach in my classes that, we started our careers probably in line level positions where we were doing a lot of work.
Mhm.
If you are now a general manager, if you are now a senior leader at a club, your job isn't to do the work anymore. Your job is to lead people
Mhm.
that do work. And people are complex. And so the reason you make the big bucks is because you've got to get good at figuring out what buttons to push to get the most out of your people. So you have a great member experience. And frankly, you have a great employee experience because that's
Yeah.
all about the culture, right?
You know,
So yeah,
it reminds
humans,
me of
we're
this.
complex. I'm telling you.
Yeah, it's this conversation I had with a friend of mine, a childhood friend of mine who's gone on to be very successful and leading large companies. And he said, he basically we were talking about his career, whatever, and he basically said that, the reason high level executives, have the positions they have and earn what they do is because they deal with people problems maybe a little bit better or differently or whatever. Like, man, I think that's so true.
And they've learned to build teams that are
Yeah,
effective, right?
totally. Right.
We're
And you
so
don't
focused many times on the operational details that we forget our jobs as the most senior leaders in any organization is to build a strong team that can execute the work.
yeah.
And that's by putting people together that work effectively with one another.
I feel like I'm kind of burying the lead by saying this late into our conversation, Jody, but it's like it just seems in this day and age, this matters now more than ever.
Yeah.
Right. And we don't live in a time right now where it's like we can say my way or the highway and get a bunch of great people. If you want to
Mm,
manage that way, you're probably going to get a bunch of mediocre performers who just want a job and punch the clock.
right.
Right.
That's absolutely right. And we're not in a labor environment right now where we get to be overly picky. When I started out in HR back in the day, on open interview days, we would have hundreds of people waiting in the hallway to go through a screening interview.
Mhm.
That doesn't happen anymore. And so being very purposeful in terms of creating that recruitment pipeline, really being smart about asking the right questions and getting the right people in the right jobs so that they can continue to grow and provide an exceptional member experience, but also knowing that depending on how they're wired, they may be in it for the long haul. So when I look at an assessment, I can tell if somebody, if they're happy in their environment, they will be a lifelong employee because of
Mhm.
how they're wired. They like familiar, they like routine, they like doing the same thing over and over again. But I also may be hiring somebody who's a change agent, that's a fixer, that I'm
Mhm.
hiring because they can fix something.
Right.
Well, if they come in and they fix it and now it's working perfectly and they're a fixer, you think they're going to stay around?
Right.
Probably not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not unless we can keep giving them projects to fix, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so, but that's also where kind of that succession planning comes into play, understanding what type of talent do I need right now, and how can I develop people for the future? Because we're in a labor environment where we have to be really strategic. And I think too, and every generation goes through this, but all the new generations, for the older generations are like, oh, this is just going to turn out terrible. You know what? All the previous generations said that about Gen X
Yeah.
and
Right.
baby boomers and everything like that. So
Yeah.
every generation is new and different, and we have to learn to adapt to those needs if we're going to be successful with the talent that we need to tap into.
No doubt. I love that. It's so true about the generational stuff. Just one tactical question, and we'll try to bring it home here. But I'm just wondering, like, can you share assessment data with the employee? I remember I did an assessment years ago, and they said you can show them this, but you can't show them this. Like,
Right.
is there anything like what do people need to know about that whole thing?
So it's a big question. I'll try to keep it a narrow answer. So there's a couple things to keep in mind. Typically, when I talk about assessment data, I'll talk about candidate data and I'll talk about employee data. Typically in the hiring process, when a candidate takes an assessment, I usually don't share it with them.
Hmm.
If they ask for it, though, it typically is a best practice because it's their data. So when we think about data privacy laws, and
Hmm.
depending on what state you live in, depending on if you're assessing people that don't live in the United States, there are global data privacy laws that we have to follow.
Hmm.
And typically what it means is if it's that candidate's assessment, then they probably have a right to see the report.
Sure.
Now, what they don't have a right to see is maybe the job target that you've created that you're comparing them to. So,
Interesting.
for example, when for my clients, I'll say, typically I don't just automatically share the assessment with a candidate, but if they ask for it, I'll give it to them.
Hmm.
But they're still not getting our business data
Sure.
and our job target. I have clients, though, that actually will share the assessment in the interview process.
Hmm.
So they'll say, as we had you do this quick 5-minute assessment, and I want to go over it with you and share my assessment with you
Hmm.
so that you know that if we end up making an offer and you decide to accept and you and I work together, here's what that working relationship's going to look like.
Hmm.
And is that what you want, right?
Right.
Because they're assessing you just as much as you're assessing them. So,
Sure.
so being transparent in the process, I think, can be very beneficial as well. And
For sure.
then to that end, on the employee side,
Mhm.
absolutely. I mean, there's no reason to have the assessment data if you're not sharing it.
Right.
If I don't know how you're wired, Ed, I don't know how to adapt to meet your needs and vice versa.
Yeah.
So transparency, in my opinion, especially with behavioral data, is really important
Yeah.
within the organization so we can all work together effectively.
Right. And in most cases, this goes without saying, I think, but it's confidential,
Mm-hmm.
right? Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah. And what we've mostly talked about today is behavioral data. So, typically I wouldn't share with everybody if I didn't have the approval of everybody to share.
Mhm.
However, if it's something that's ingrained in your culture and it's part of the process and that transparency is important and it's not being used against somebody,
Right.
and there's this level of trust, then typically there's not any challenges with that. Another component of assessment data in the hiring process that we haven't really talked about, but many companies use, is cognitive data.
Mm.
So we've been talking about behaviors,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
then there's also where we assess cognitive ability. Cognitive ability isn't about
How smart you
intelligence.
are. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
IQ
about
test.
how quickly, yeah, it's about how quickly you process and learn.
Mm,
And so typically that data, I keep under lock and key in human resources because it's a really important predictor of performance in the hiring process, but it could also be misused because it's associated with a number. Right.
mm,
So,
mhm.
if somebody sees my cognitive score, they may think I'm, smarter or not as smart as they are because I'm higher or lower than them.
Sure.
That's not what it's all about. So there is some data that really should remain confidential. And typically the person that's supporting you in the assessment process will walk you through that. But yeah, behavior data, I think, is important for it to be transparent. Cognitive data should not.
Yeah. Interesting. Good advice. All right. So just a little bit of a plug in as we discuss, I do my best to not sell in this podcast, but you work with the tool Predictive Index.
Mhm, mhm.
And people might, like I mentioned, Myers-Briggs and Strengths Finders, and there's people who are Enneagram people or whatever.
Yep.
What is it, just for people who may not be familiar with Predictive Index? How would you sort of summarize the tool and and how you typically use it?
Yeah,
I mean, I
absolutely.
know.
So yeah. And, as I've been trying not to say PI all along
Yeah,
the
yeah,
way, right? I mean, I've
yeah.
been doing pretty good.
You did a good
But
job.
I've been trying. Ultimately, Predictive Index is a talent optimization platform the goal is that it's used top to bottom in an organization. So that's how it's priced. It's a flat fee. You can use it on an unlimited basis, every applicant, every job, every employee. And the goal is that everybody in the organization utilizes it. They go through education. It becomes a language that's utilized not only in the hiring process, but onboarding, relationships, performance management, all of those sorts of things. So it's really a helpful tool, especially for leaders, to be able to interact with their employees on a level that's really going to help them connect and help them perform at a high level.
Mhm.
So I've utilized PI for years. I was actually introduced to it when I worked at the Four Seasons, and used it top to bottom when I moved over to the Rams. We, obviously professional sports has used data and analytics for decades.
Mhm.
And so we started using it on the business side. And that's really where we started to get that culture change and better understanding what makes people tick when we have that data. So I've been a user of PI for many, many years, both on the HR side and then certainly on the certified partner side, where I sell and support PI
Mhm.
with organizations as little as 10 people and as big as thousands.
Right.
And the goal is that it's a very easy to use tool. It's a quick assessment, usually 5-6 minutes for somebody
Mhm.
to take a behavioral assessment. And then there is a ton of self-directed learning resources for managers to utilize the data to be better leaders.
Got it. So is it like, I was mentioning, like, oh, whether your strength is woo or you're an ENFJ, or is it like one of those where it's like it'll kind of tell you like what your characteristics are in that way, or what's the output?
So you get your behavioral profile, and at kind of a macro level, we have 17 different reference profiles. So these are in general how people are wired,
Mhm.
but each assessment taker gets their own profile. So it's specific to who they are. So they don't fall into a bucket necessarily, because we're all individuals and we're all unique. And
Sure.
so when an assessment report comes back, there's basically a graph that tells you how much dominance and extroversion and patience and formality does somebody have. And that helps you predict how they're going to behave in the workplace, because it also shows us how strong those behaviors are, or maybe how situational and easy it is for somebody to adapt those behaviors. But we do have kind of that macro level of, for example, my reference profile is an operator. There's collaborators, there's strategists, there's mavericks. Everybody always loves it when they're a
Yeah.
maverick because it's a cool title.
Yeah.
But who I am behaviorally is really based on my specific behavioral profile.
Okay. Got it. Interesting. All right. So one last thing.
Mhm.
If I'm listening, I've made it this far in this episode, and I'm going, all right, I have a job posting that we're going to get out. I've not used assessments before. What's a great first step aside from calling you? What would be something that general manager might want to do?
Well, typically, an assessment tool, and I do it, and I'm sure probably my competitors do it as well. I typically will do a pilot on a position. So let's say you're hiring a director of food and beverage, and it's a really important hire for you. Reach out to me. I'll help you make a job target, and we'll assess 3 to 5 candidates, your top 3 to 5 candidates, and I'll walk you through how good of a match those candidates are. I'll give you some interview questions that you can incorporate into some of your final interviews, so that you can see how the data works in the process, right? I mean, you don't buy a car without test driving it.
Mhm.
Well, maybe these days you do. You just buy it
Yeah.
online. But anyways, I digress. So you wouldn't want to use an assessment tool or buy an assessment tool without using it. Let's see how it
Right.
works. And can I integrate it into my HRIS system or my ATS system? Those are all HR terms for IT resources. But how can I make it easy for my managers to use it? And I want to see that data in action.
Yeah. Awesome. Great suggestion.
Mhm.
Jodie, I love this stuff. I'm a total assessment junkie. Although I do need to take PI. I've got that assessment link.
I sent you the link.
I
I
know
sent you the link.
I want to try it out. But just to reiterate the cost, while some people might look at the cost of any assessment or some, a tool like this or a resource and, think twice, my gosh, the cost of making the wrong hire is just, not to mention mental and emotional well-being of the supervisors. I mean, it's huge. So thanks for all your insight today, Jodie.
Absolutely. My pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Talk again soon. And thank you for listening. If you find episodes like this helpful, be sure to share it and subscribe on whatever podcast platform you're using. Until next time, keep crushing your club marketing.